In this next set of lecture videos, we're going to be talking about interest groups. After after you've watched all of the lecture videos, you'll be able to distinguish between public interest groups and private interest groups. And you'll also be able to distinguish between collective goods, sometimes referred to as public goods, and private goods. You'll be able to explain why interest groups have what's called a free rider problem. You'll be able to explain what interest groups have that candidates need. And then one of the things I'm going to emphasize is you'll be able to explain what interest groups have that policymakers need. So not just people who are running for office, but people who have been elected, but also people in the bureaucracy. But we'll talk about that a little bit more. You'll be able to distinguish between the inside and outside strategies used by interest groups, and you'll be able to explain why and when these strategies are most likely to be effective. And then finally, you'll be able to identify 4 advantages that private interest groups have over public interest groups, and once you're able to do this, you'll be able to evaluate the usefulness of interest groups in American politics. So let me give you a little preview of where I'm headed with this. As a general rule, when people talk about interest groups or special interest groups, they tend to speak of them in a negative way. There's like a negative emotional tag associated with interest groups. And so quite often when people talk about interest groups, they do so in a very negative light. One of the things that I'm going to be trying to do in the set of lecture videos is give an alternative story about the role of interest groups. In other words, I'm going to emphasize the positive impact of special interest groups in our political system. But at the end, I'm going to talk about some of the concerns that people have about the role that interest groups play, and they're very legitimate concerns. I don't want to skip, so I'm not going to skip over them, but I want to make sure that you guys have both sides of the story. And I worry that sometimes one side of the story gets a lot more attention than the other side. So my job is going to be to give you both sides. I hope, by the way, this picture behind me isn't distracting. I know when I have my head like this, it kind of looks like I have this like huge, like my hair is like exploding, like my Albert Einstein kind of look going on here or something. But in any case, this is a painting by a woman named Karen Marcus, who's a dear friend of mine. I actually have a couple of her paintings in my house. And so I wanted to do this particular video in front of this picture along with my plants. I have a bunch of plants around the house. I love plants, and she paints flowers all the time. So in any case, I digress. Let's talk interest groups. So obviously, we have to start off by making sure that we all are using interest groups in the same way. So what are interest groups? When I'm talking about interest groups, I'm talking about organizations that are trying to shape public policy. Now, political scientists talk about public policy all the time as if everybody knows what that term means. Maybe a lot of you do, but maybe some of you don't. And so just to be clear, the phrase public policy refers to the way government officials address problems that affect the public in some way. So whether or not they're passing laws, or whether the bureaucracy is issuing what are called rules, anything that affects our day-to-day life is going to be an example of a public policy. So it's a very broad term that sort of refers to anything that the government does, any policies that they adopt that affect our lives in some way. So with that in mind, I want to go over some examples and ask you to think about whether or not these groups constitute an interest group, right? And the way to answer that is to go back and think about the definition. Are they trying to shape public policy in some way? If the answer is yes, then of course they're public interest groups, with one exception, and we'll talk about that in a second. So the AMA, the American Medical Association, this is an organization. If you're a doctor, a medical doctor, every medical doctor in the United States is a member of the American Medical Association. And They have offices in Washington, D.C. and all over the country, trying to persuade policymakers to adopt policies that are favorable to doctors. Now, hopefully they're favorable to patients too, but that's not the job of the AMA. The job of the AMA is to protect the interests of doctors. So are they an interest group? You can see if you have your lecture notes available to you, you can either circle it yes or no, or highlight yes or no. Well, hopefully you said yes, because that's exactly what they do. They try and shape public policy in a way that's favorable to doctors. So let's go to the next one, the ABA, the American Bar Association. Now, just for those of you who don't know, I'm not talking about an organization that is related to bartenders. It's not that bar, it's the legal bar. Lawyers, when they become lawyers in the United States, have to become members of the American Bar Association. And the goal of the American Bar Association is to protect the interests of lawyers. So are they an interest group? Yes, they are. Hopefully you said that they were. And so the way this would work, do you remember our definition of politics? Politics is a struggle over the allocation of benefits and privileges, right? And we also talked about something called pluralist democracy. Very at the beginning of the lecture, the idea that the struggle over the allocation of benefits and privileges isn't a struggle between individuals like it was in caveman days, but that the struggle is between organizations, organized groups. So imagine for a moment that Congress is considering passing a law that would make it harder for people to sue doctors. And the reasoning for it might be that doctors have to pay a lot in malpractice insurance. And so it's easy to sue doctors. Their insurance is going to cost them more money, and that means they're going to charge us more money. And so in theory, if Congress makes it harder to sue doctors, that might bring down their costs. Well, is the AMA going to be in favor of a law that makes it harder to sue doctors? Yeah, they're like, that's awesome, that's great, we love that. The American Bar Association, how are they going to feel about that? A law that makes it harder to sue doctors? Yeah, they're not going to like that at all, right? And so this is where interest groups clash in the way that we were talking about, thinking in terms of my definition of politics, the struggle over the allocation of benefits and privileges, and this notion of pluralist democracy, that the struggle takes place between organized groups. So that's a little bit of a review, trip down memory lane. What about the Tom Cruise fan club? Is this an interest group? Now, in my in-person classes, I always get like a variety of very strange answers to this. Students are usually joking about what public policy the Tom Cruise fan club might be interested in. Sometimes they refer to Mr. Cruise's religion, but the reality is no, it's not a public interest group. I'm honestly not sure whether or not there's actually a Tom Cruise fan club. I assume there is, right? But that wouldn't be an interest group. This is a tricky one, so I'm telling you ahead of time, this is a tricky one. The Republican and Democratic parties, are they interest groups? Are they trying to shape public policy? Well, probably some of you are thinking yes, right? But if you recall back to the previous lecture, political parties have a very specific definition. Political parties are trying to take control of the government through elections, right? They want to take control of the whole government so that they can make public policy, right? So they don't qualify as an interest group just by definition. They have a different role than interest groups. So the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, neither one of them would qualify as an interest group because they're political parties. Another complicated one. The Los Angeles Unified School District. Is that an example of an interest group? Now, usually students say yes. And you know why? Because students are smart. Yeah, they are an interest group. They're going to be going to Sacramento the capital of California, or Washington, D.C., and they're going to be trying to encourage policymakers to spend as much money in California and in Los Angeles in particular as possible. And you know what? The Dallas Unified School District, the New York Unified School District, they're going to be doing the same things, right? So the Los Angeles Unified School District is, in fact, functions as an interest group. They have a group of people who go and talk to policymakers on behalf of LAUSD. So who are these people that I'm talking about? That's what we'll be discussing in the next video.